Good afternoon, and very pleased to be here, delighted to be invited, but also terrified stiff because in terms of clinical knowledge, my knowledge is very inferior to yourselves. So those of you who are looking for clinical insights, you can have a quick sleep for the next 20 minutes. What I am going to do, though, is I hope I'm going to get you to ask a few questions about cutting, female genital mutilation, female genital cutting, and to think about perhaps a little bit more about why it happens, where it's happening, who's driving it, and what are the approaches to ending it. And I would just say here and now, of course, I'm totally against the cut, and I'd like to see it end as soon as possible. Whether that means zero tolerance, well, I'm not sure about that. But what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is I want to give you a little bit of background. I want to think a little bit about what are the drivers for cutting. We often, and I certainly when I started working against the cut, I thought, well, I can't understand why there would be any drivers in favour of it. But now I understand them a bit better. And then also thinking about what are some of the approaches to abandoning the cut, to ending the cut. And then finally asking perhaps yourselves some questions that you might be asking in your clinical practice. So who am I, what am I doing here? It was first in 1992 in fact in an Islamic fundamentalist community in Egypt that I first came across the cut. And some women raised it with me and wanted it raising with the community there. Most of my work has been in Sierra Leone and Kenya, Kenya in particular, and Kenya is a country that I want to tell you a little bit about today. So I did some research which was actually looking at what are the drivers towards cutting, and also looking at this approach called alternative rites of passage. And I also, in addition to the things up there, I have two daughters myself. Both of my daughters have children. One was cut, one wasn't cut. The cut one, no, we didn't just think, oh, we'll do a little test and see. Our cut daughter is Sierra Leonean, and she was cut before she came to us. FGM's really in the media at the moment. We've got a lot going on, and as you'll see, BBC News, the cutting season, talking about cutting in Tanzania, and I love the Britain lags behind in the FGM fight. You know, there's yet another league table that we're down at the bottom of, and that one was on the basis of prosecutions. So it's very much there and it's here. The government has been looking at it for a while. It was raised to David Cameron's attention about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, just before the last general election, and he's taken a little bit of a personal interest in it. A few stats. So we're talking about 125 million girls and women who've undergone the cut. It's quite a number, really. 3 million subjected to the cut every year. The next one, I thought you'd like this. More than 18% is being performed by healthcare workers, and that proportion is increasing year on year. More and more of the cut are being performed by healthcare workers. Some people celebrate that. I'll come on to that in a minute. There was a Home Affairs, this is from the Home Affairs Select Committee, 170,000 women and girls living with the effects of the cut in the UK. So that's quite a number. And it's been 29 years since the criminalisation of cutting in the UK. 29 years it took for us to get our first prosecution. It was not a very well selected case, and of course it failed quite spectacularly last year. So that's really where we are in the UK. Leaping out to think WHO and where we are, I'm sure you've all seen this at various stages, the types, the definitions, all rather cold and clinical. I think it's rather more, when we look at some of the instruments that are used, I think it actually gives us rather more of a taste for what's happening here. And certainly where I've been working in Kenya, that pair of scissors was actually it's quickest actually, and so it's best for the girls, because then the other ones waiting in line don't have to wait so long, because we can get it done a little bit quicker. So that was the argument in favour of the scissors when I was doing my research there. So what are the drivers for cutting? Why is it happening, and what's kind of driving it forward? The cleanliness of mind and body and spirit is an incredibly deep-rooted belief, and it's something which is the most difficult thing to overcome. There's also the word beauty in there. We might agree or disagree with what might make a beautiful female bottom. To reduce sexual urge and promiscuity, absolutely, definitely, that's there. It's an ongoing fear, and it's certainly one that is waved in the faces of those of us who are working against the cut, in that there you are, you don't cut, and look at the promiscuity in your country. Do we really want to emulate that? To reduce disease and infection, to prepare for marriage and childbirth. There are arguments of saying, well, if a woman gets used to, as a young girl, get used to the pain of the cut, that's going to help with childbirth as we go. I'm not supporting any of these, of course. Very much, fundamentally, it's a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. And also, again, because it's their culture, and this whole idea about it's our culture, it's embedded within, how dare somebody from the outside come along and want to try and break this culture. And one down the bottom there, a word you might not be expecting to see, of love and social acceptance. One of the most shocking things to me when I started doing research into FGM was that these are parents that could be, like me or many of you. They're loving, caring parents. I'll say it again. They're loving, caring parents who actually want the best for their children, their girls. Now, getting my head around that was quite a challenge. So, moving on. It is a social norm. In the communities where it is prevalent, and in Kisii and Kuria in Kenya, where I do most of my work on FGM, we're talking about, when I first started, it was about 95% cutting. Now it's down to about 80% in the communities that we're not working in, and we think it might be as low as 60% where we are working. But here we are. It's the biggest celebration of my life, said a young girl. When she's cut, she's going to get new clothes, presents, gifts. She's going to be celebrated, and she's ready to move on into that next stage of her life. It's the biggest party in the community, the most meat available. And then the other one, that if she's not cut, she actually won't be able to marry, she won't be allowed to go to any of the community celebrations. People actually won't buy the vegetables that she grows because they've been grown by an uncut woman. So suddenly we see that being cut and not cut is it's a much broader thing. The actual physical cut isn't perhaps, question, as damaging as the lifelong acceptance or social unacceptance. Things are changing. They're changing quite rapidly. There's new laws. It's been outlawed in Kenya since 2001. Of course, we've got the Children's Act, which more and more countries are taking up, and more countries like Sierra Leone, for example, is now still in the process of discussing whether or not to introduce a law against cutting for under the age of consent. another discussion point, why under the age of consent. But it is changing. One of the things that's happening in countries where the law is quite actively pursued is girls are being cut younger. They're being cut maybe as young as 5. Why? Because if the girls are younger, they won't be able to oppose. They also, if we cut them, they may be able to still stay in school, because school dropout and being cut are very much, they go hand in hand for many of the teenagers. Also, we've got the introduction of what is called the lesser cuts. And with that, the medicalisation. I said earlier, 18% of cuts are being taken place by health professionals. And that's on the rise. And this idea of a lesser cut. So instead of totally removing the clitoris, then we'll just do a nick. We'll just do a scraping. So very much a lesser cut. Some organisations support the lesser cut. Myself, I don't. I'm a bit of an idealist, and I think we should be saying no to cutting full stop. But it is a move in a direction. So there is a gradual reduction. There are some prosecutions in quite a number of countries, but the number of prosecutions is really quite small. So one has to question whether prosecution is really the way to go. I said earlier that it was about loving parents, wanting to do the very best for their children. And here's a few people who've made or are making difficult choices. So who shall I start with? The young woman with the baby in the middle there, she was a woman that I met just in January this last year. And she was not cut as a child. Her family were more educated and they decided not to cut her. She actually keeps the fact that she was not cut secret from the whole of the rest of the community, because there are some instances of people actually being cut, or quite a lot of people being cut during childbirth or after childbirth. She has actually maintained her position in the community, but under a false pretense of saying she was cut. So that's one way of doing it. It doesn't really change attitudes very much, but it's one way of her surviving. The other young woman over on the right, I met her about 18 months ago. She's not cut either. Now she actually, her father stood against the cut. Her father was actually killed about 15 years ago when she was not cut. So that family has no father now. He was killed, and she is now growing up without a father. And she is living with knowing that her father's life was taken because she was not cut. Am I worth it? You know, we could still have both been alive, but yet I would just have been cut. So some of these decisions are tough decisions. The guy over here on the left, he wants to get married fairly soon. He would actually quite like to marry an uncut girl. He doesn't believe in the cut. But actually, if he marries an uncut girl, he then will probably not be accepted within his own community. So what's it better for him to do? Is it better that he marries a cut girl or not? So he's got to make those kind of decisions. If he has daughters, and he's talking about it right now, is he going to have his daughters cut? And the man down the bottom is a church leader who was campaigning quite extensively against the cut. He thought his whole congregation had agreed they weren't going to cut last December during the cutting season. Yes, the whole idea of a cutting season is something. 5 minutes, right. He then has to make this decision. What do I do with the people who then had their daughters cut? Do I welcome them back into the church, or do I exclude them? So there's a lot of people making decisions in those communities. Here's a decision that I'm sure you'll read this and think, no, it's a no-brainer, really. So here she is, a health worker, being approached, and being approached by a friend, and being asked if she will cut the girls, because if she does a lesser cut, there'll be no health complications. I find this one quite chilling. If she says no, that mother will go elsewhere and have her daughters cut. If she says yes, there's other things. Right, moving on. All these different approaches that we've got. So, rescue camps, there's a lot of places that actually work with rescue camps. But actually, rescue camps really aren't working. They're taking girls away from. We need to be doing things down the bottom, which is about community abandonment approaches. And this is what I've been doing. We're working with the whole communities. We're using participatory approaches. We are seeing cutting as a community practice, not the choice of individuals and individual parents. We're working with schools, health workers, local chiefs, and all different members of the community. And we are using storytelling, so that health worker, we're actually using storytelling to actually help her to make some decisions. And we're a local women's-led organisation which is running workshops right across communities, and communities are choosing to abandon as a whole community. So we've had our disappointments. This last December cut, we reckon we've got the cuts down to about 60% in our communities. It's far too high, but it's come down from 80 to 60%. This young woman, Gatti, she attended girls' empowerment programs in 2012 and 2013. She avoided being cut in 2012, and she promised her uncles that she'd be cut in 2014. But with our local paralegals, we've actually finally, her family has agreed that she wasn't going to be cut. So she's just one girl, and she's now going to be a champion for change in her community and working towards the abandonment in her community. My final slide. Where does this leave us and where we are? I'm thinking here, wanting to bring right back to the UK, where our approach of change has been about sustained community dialogue. That means people have got to be able to talk about things. So are we actually promoting or are we suppressing dialogue? If we're threatening to report, what happens to confidentiality of patients and openness? Does the process go underground, which it certainly is now? Am I the sort of health professional where people would actually be willing to raise this issue with me? Because that's how we actually get about change. And of course, not forgetting that, how does it fit within your professional code of conduct? So it was a little bit of a whiz through, but thinking that every person who's thinking about having their daughters cut in the UK is coming from a community and an embedded social practice, and that's what's driving them, rather than the UK clinical legal law. I'll finish there.
Are there any questions? I have one quick one. I've come across this occasionally on Labour Board. Is it a reportable thing if we come across someone who's evidently been cut? What's the legal obligation for us to report or to raise that issue?
It is reportable, and of course there's a whole issue about being able to report when it was that it happened, which is what the legal case, one of the issues around the legal case that failed. So yes, it is reportable, They are talking at the moment. The government's still in negotiations with other, so the teachers' unions. It's been raised with, and the whole question about across British society who should be reporting and how many people should. So should teachers be reporting? Should inspections be being carried out? And for you, of course, should it be reported? And I guess I don't know what your code of conduct is actually going to come up with. And historically, how long ago do you report? If a woman was cut as a teenage, and you're now seeing her and this is her third child, then frankly, how much good is it going to do if you're going to drag up the whole history? But if it's something that's happened much more recently than that, then one would imagine yes.
There's also a safeguarding issue, isn't there, for our midwifery and obstetric colleagues, that a woman who has been cut has a female child. It then needs to be passed on to safeguarding teams. That child could potentially be at risk in the future.
Yes, and I think we need to have far more discussion within safeguarding teams around a non-judgmental. When I say non-judgmental, actually trying to understand the drivers for the cut and the difficulty of the decisions being made, because simply pulling the law into play, you have the fear of law, but then you also have a fear of perhaps the witchcraft from Kenya, which might come, so you've actually got some very difficult decisions to be made. We simply say, here's Western law, you will comply. We need to be much more compassionate about our decision making.
I'm sorry to be dense.
I obviously don't understand that. It's obviously a hugely complex subject, but the driver, I was under the impression that to draw an analogy, a sort of Victorian father would want his daughter not to be sexually promiscuous but how does that work for the girl or the woman's partner? It would take away the potential pleasure for him, wouldn't it?
Yes, so you've got certainly in Korea and Kisi, you've got a high degree of men who will marry cut women, but then they'll have affairs with, say, Luos, women in the neighbouring communities who are not cut. There's also quite a drive for men now and young men to be thinking about, okay, I will marry an uncut girl, which will give me a better sex life. But along with that, is that all that it's about? Women being objectified rather than being married for their own sake. And so it's quite a complicated issue, because some men now are thinking, right, well, I'll marry an uncut girl, but I still expect her to drop out of school, have no education, and so stop that part of. So looking at the education, whether or not she's cut, future employment situations, all in the whole, as a woman's right or a young girl's right, rather than the cut just on its own.
Any other questions?
So we'd like to donate £300 to Feed the Minds charity. Thank you very much indeed for coming to speak.